Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. This is the Insight segment. I'm Harold Fisher. It has been 100 days since Donald Trump was inaugurated as the 47th President of the United States. Many of his campaign promises have been kept. Cracking down on immigration, getting rid of DEI, shrinking the number of federal government employees, and much more. But how Americans feel about those promises depends on their political leanings and how they have been impacted. Well, tonight, we're talking about the Trump administration's first 100 days and the impact on Black people in this country. We are at the Political Roundtable. My guests are Glenn Harris, president of Race Forward, a national racial equity organization, and Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter, professor of sociology and African studies at UCLA. He's also the author of the book, Radical Reparations, Healing the Soul of a Nation. Gentlemen, thank you so much for talking to us. I appreciate it. It's an important conversation.
You already know. Thanks for having us.
Sure thing.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's talk about a quick set of fast facts. According to a new PBS NPR Marist poll just released today, 45% of U.S. adults rated Trump's return to the Oval Office an F, including 80% of Democrats and 49% of independents. 23% of Americans, including 54% of Republicans, gave the president an A. 53% disapprove of his leadership, a 4-point drop since March, and another 42% approve, a 3-point drop that is within the margin of error. The percentage of Americans who strongly approve of Donald Trump dropped 6 points. Let me ask you both, and I can start with you, Glenn. What are your thoughts about those poll numbers?
I think they tell us everything we need to know. That President Trump's second term has been the most destabilizing in American history. I mean, you named it. I saw approval ratings today that were 39%. It's the lowest of any newly elected president dating back, before Eisenhower. So, I think it's just telling us what we know. The administration has undermined both the legislative and the judicial branches. Really trying to consolidate all of the power in the administrative branch. We see our communities, especially Black communities, directly under attack in this moment. But I think the piece that's so important about this 100-day mark is not where this administration is at in its rankings. It's seeing everyday Americans showing up to resist. And I think, we're seeing it through protests. We're seeing it through opposition to Elon Musk's role in dismantling the federal institutions. We see resistance in the number of lawsuits that are being filed in this moment. And we see resistance through the record number of constituents who just are showing up for their town hall meetings. I think what's important about this 100 days for me is what does resistance look like in this country as we are confronted by what increasingly seems obvious as an authoritarian threat to our communities.
Mm-hmm. Your thoughts, Dr. Hunter, about those numbers that I just shared?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things, and they're kind of cliche, but I think they apply because a lot of this 100 days has been a cliche. You play dangerous games, you win dangerous prizes. And one of my favorites from the culture is that the whites are whiting, and I think it's important, that we also see how Black folks have been responding to some of these things. We saw the hands-off demonstrations, and on the internet, there was a very funny set of memes and GIFs going around that show Black people hearing about this hands-off and packing a bag. And then there's a voice that sounds kind of like Paul Robeson that says, sit your ass down. Because ultimately, underneath the comedy of it all are two things. One, Black people can and do survive. That we have down. We have that down.
Yeah, we do.
And I think what we're seeing is a lot of other communities who are coming in at that, giving a F, 39%, and all those other numbers, looking to Black people. What are y'all doing? How have y'all been doing this? How have y'all been able to maintain this for hundreds of years? And our response has been, we got our boots on the ground. Where your fans at? Finding joy in that process, and also allowing other groups to come to a realization, because Black people collectively took a stand and made it clear where they thought those 100 days would be, where they thought the next 4 years would be, but they were kind of left to their own devices. And now what I see is some of those percentages catching up to where Black people were to begin with.
Glenn, what do you think has been the thing that stands out most to you during these past 100 days? What was the thing that had you grabbing your imaginary pearls?
I try to avoid the pearl clutching, but I will say, it's a hard one to answer because it's two.
Okay.
I think the attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is, taking, Jim Crow stance and wrapping it in a new package. That's all it is. That, not surprised by it. Maybe surprised at how quickly it has destabilized many communities.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that in response to it, right? Like, so if we think about what Trump has been actually doing over the last 100 days, it's really centered in this idea of dividing us, right? It's a simple idea. And in that way, everything else follows in its wake. So that's why I was saying, like, I think the tariffs conversation made it plain for white folks, just being real, about what the impact of this chaos can mean in their lives. But even the tariffs are tied to this line of actually thinking about what equity means or doesn't mean in America. And so I think the piece for me that seems so critical, and I love what Dr. Hunter named, is that, the Black Project in America has been democracy, right? And it's just this recognition that you can't have democracy without justice and equity, without fairness. It's just a simple idea. And so I think the most important part in this is this narrative fight. You know what I'm saying? So like we think back to the civil rights period, and we think about all the policy changes that fundamentally changed people's lives. But the narrative fight, it actually was the first time in America where being a racist wasn't okay. That was what the fight was about. And we're in a moment trying to push us back to that fight. So I'm just really conscious that even as we think about all the policy pieces, whether it's immigration, whether it's tariffs, et cetera, the through line is really about this question of fundamental fairness and who we be as a country.
Dr. Hunter, speaking of taking you back, I want to go all the way back to 2005 after Hurricane Katrina. Kanye West famously said, President Bush doesn't care about Black people. It was so controversial at the time. If said about this Trump presidency, would it be so controversial?
No, I mean, the irony of it is that one could even now say Kanye West doesn't care about Black people. I mean, if you fast forward all the way, so it's a really interesting point that you bring up there as we move history forward. I think on top of that, sometimes, and this is my personal opinion. Okay, so take it with a boulder of salt. But I'm of the mindset that I think it's important for Black people and communities of color to always be mindful about not always feeling like you have to make yourself a character in the story. And sometimes, so what I mean, for example, is when we're looking at the dais of people that he's picked, the first go around, we had Omarosa and Ben Carson and some other people who were Black in this. This time, we're not really in the mix that way. And a lot of the people who are been directly attacked are not necessarily Black people. Now, we are catching strays, as we say. But I think it's important for us to be able to also see this as an opportunity for other people to come into an awareness that we already have, that we already know, because people were campaigning over the 107 days that we had to get Kamala into office. People were making these arguments. There were Black women highlighting they were taking, underlining and blowing up, making poster boards of Project 2025, and they were told that they were being ridiculous. They were told that they were doing scare tactics, all of it to be actually true. And so I think part of it is also to say, there's a West Indian phrase that I learned from a West Indian mother of mine, Beryl Shaw, who says, "Those who do not hear will feel." And I think a lot of people are feeling it because they really did not hear it. And what you hear a lot in a lot of the aftermath of people going, "I voted for Trump, but I didn't know he was talking about my wife being deported." So that tells us about the tone deafness of the conversation. We were not going to be able to reach those folks because they really just had their whole hearing off. They were not thinking that he was talking about them, even though he was using very intentional language. So I also think part of this for me is a lesson in those who refuse to hear, then being made to feel. I think the other thing about a lot of this is to remember that some of the stuff that's happening around birthright citizenship is also another thing that Black people bequeathed this nation. So it's also a gift that we have given, being abused and misused to harm other people's humanity. So it's this really interesting paradigm where so many of the features of freedom that Black people brought to America are being disfigured and distorted and then weaponized against people who are non-white. And all of that time when Black people were trying to create this coalition of multiracial, multi-generational folks who just thought like, "Oh, y'all are just Trump haters. Y'all just hate Republicans." They're like, "No, we love democracy. That's what we're saying. We think democracy already had a chance."
I've got a minute before the break, but Glenn, I wanted to ask you about what Dr. Hunter is saying, because in the in the vein of the FOFO, it seems like a lot of folks are finding out even if they didn't mess around. But it seems like everyone is finding out, even if they didn't think that they were in the basket.
Agreed. Yeah, and for me, it's I've been doing this work for over 35 years. When I first started this work, it was in Northwest part of the country, and it was in the late 80s, early 90s, and there were like skinheads and neo-Nazis everywhere. Understanding what far-right authoritarianism looks like is real. And I think in this moment, even as folks are finally catching up to how this hurts, I think it's so critical that people look. You don't have to look to history. Just look across the pond to Europe and understand what that movement looks like.
Hold that point. Don't forget that point, because I want you to continue with that. But I do need to take a quick break. Don't forget, you can hear this in every edition of the Daily Drum Inside segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The Original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR. I'm Harold Fisher. This conversation continues on Sirius XM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We are at the Political Roundtable tonight, continuing our conversation about the Trump administration's first 100 days and the impact on Black people in this country. My guests are Glenn Harris, president of Race Forward, a national racial equity organization, and Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter, professor of sociology and African studies at UCLA. He is also the author of the book Radical Reparations, Healing the Soul of a Nation. Glenn, before the break, you were talking about looking at far-right politics and the fact that sometimes you can just look in your own backyard. Please continue your point.
Yeah, I was just naming that, even though I think people are starting to feel it, to Dr. Hunter's point, I don't know if they yet understand it. So I don't think they still haven't heard it, which is that what this is a fundamental threat to everyone in this country. It's a fundamental threat to our positionality as a nation in the world. And that those risks have impacts on all of us. And so so I just think it's so important we naming it. That's what I'm naming, Harold.
So yeah, and to that point, and this is one of the things that we have heard when you talk about resistance of late, and where there's been a criticism of the Democrats, where they were saying we need to protect democracy and we need to beware of anything that looks like, smells like, feels like fascism. Some would argue, Glenn, that you have to be of a certain age to even know what that means, or you have to be a student of history, not a scholar, but someone who's constantly learning. Because on one hand, and we've seen this not just now, but Glenn, you can talk to young adults, young Black adults who are spending more time on social media and perhaps less time reading or less time watching documentaries, and they will say, well, what does civil rights have to do with me? Because no one is telling them, or they are not learning. And there is a danger of what we talked about on this program for a time: low information voters, low information people.
Agreed.
And that can be problematic.
It can be deeply problematic. And I think it's why I think it's important we name big picture what's happening, right? I've been saying this all week. I feel like my work in my world over the last 2 months is people have been running up to me saying, hey, everything fell off my shelves and broke. And then another person runs up and says, hey, had to run across my house barefoot, cross broken glass, cut my feet up. Another person's like, hey, the garage collapsed on my car and destroyed it. And it's like, folks, that's an earthquake. That's what that does. And so I think it's really important in this moment we hold the scale of it. But here's the deal. People actually experience that in the immediacy, to your point, in the point that they feel it. And so I think it's important, especially if you think about the Black community. One of the things that I think is important in this moment is there's no question that many of the impacts are happening on immigrants, right? We see attacks on many other communities. But I actually think in typical fashion, we're really not holding how deep the impact is on the Black community. And that we need to lift that up. When we talk about over 100,000 jobs lost at the federal level, make no mistake about it. There is a huge disproportionate impact on Black and brown people being laid off in those jobs, right? That is how Black America actually built the middle class, is through government jobs.
So to your point, because you're in Southern California, Dr. Hunter is in UCLA, but we are here in the Mid-Atlantic, specifically in the DMV, DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And you're absolutely right that so many Black people who became or remained in the middle class, particularly in Maryland, because of those good government jobs. And we are constantly feeling the impact here. But on the other side of the country, anecdotally, is it having the same impact there? We're talking here tens of thousands of Black people who have lost their federal government jobs. But what's happening in California?
Yeah, I will say, as one of, now I think it's upwards of thousands of scholars, I received a notice just a few months ago that a grant that I had been working on across a couple of universities on an initiative called the Archives for Racial and Cultural Healing was abruptly canceled, and that was a $1 million grant. And that was across 2 campuses. So George Mason University on the East Coast and UCLA here. There are colleagues who had NSF grants. They've been canceled. NIH grants that have been canceled. And the reason why I bring those things up is because I think, as you know, things in the academy can be very esoteric. You know, who knows what's really going on. And so when people hear grant cancellation, they go, whatever, you know, that's bad, but you don't know what that means. And in some cases, that means that that can be a major driver of how many people are able to afford to pursue a master's degree, MBA, a PhD. And so that now means that many students of color now no longer have a direct means to be able to afford to pursue a post-baccalaureate education. And so now we're not necessarily seeing the immediate impact yet, but this will definitely have a chilling effect on the numbers that we see of Black MBAs, Black PhDs, Black MPHs. What will that mean? You know, and what is the chilling effect around people then being able to pursue their scholarship or research through grants? You know, that is a whole other world that I think is also creating a really, really dangerous scenario where people are now getting caught in a limbo where your funding is gone. And also maybe your dream is being deferred. And what are you supposed to do in that? Because also, as we've seen, despite all of these endowments, these billion-dollar endowments here, billion-dollar endowments there, we're learning that, you know, Harvard in any given year was getting $2 billion in government funding. So what is catching up with that gap? And so those gaps are real. And I want people to really understand when you're seeing those monies being weaponized, being hijacked, and then being used to bully schools into whatever posture or position that the administration is trying to make. Those are students, you know, those are faculty members. Those dollars represent people's careers, you know, people's degrees that maybe they won't be able to complete. They represent cures. They represent, you know, focus groups. They represent new findings, new science that may now not happen because of all of this gamesmanship to make a point that I don't think many people really, really know what the point is.
Let me ask you this, and I think this is particularly pertinent to this discussion. Okay, your book, Radical Reparations: Healing the Soul of a Nation. I'm sorry to tell you, it looks like you're going to have to go back and rewrite it because the book talks about healing. These are new wounds that are, number one, being inflicted. And I remember a couple of years ago, there was this huge hearing on Capitol Hill about reparations.
Yeah.
All of that is out the door now. Is your book still germane considering where we are now?
I think so. And I would say, what better time than now to make that point? So this book originally came out during the Biden-Harris administration. Now that is supposed to be, you know, friendly territory, except during those years, we didn't get any real movement. Over those many different State of the Unions, one of my biggest complaints that I made directly to the Biden-Harris administration is not once did we hear at the State of the Union President Joseph R. Biden mention Breonna Taylor's name, have her mother up in the rafters, say reparations. And why I bring those things up is because political scientists have shown that what happens at the State of the Union has no statistical impact on political outcomes. So why can't we talk about it? And part of what would happen in those conversations behind closed doors would be there was a lot of fear. Well, if we go this way, we'll get sued. Or if we do this, we'll get sued. It actually should be a congressional act. You know, we want to let the Congress lead. And we're like, well, we don't have the Congress, but we do have the presidency. So can't the president use his bully pulpit? Can't the president say a word? And he didn't do it. And so for me, part of what happens is when you're in friendly territory, you tend to compromise. You tend to, you know, be a little mealy mouth about how hard you're willing to go in the paint. But now what's at stake? You know, make your demands sharp now. You want it all. You know, when you're up against a true enemy, you want everything. You know, we're not friends. You know, I don't care about your feelings. You don't care about mine. So ask for everything. I think the other thing about the reparations conversation is that what I think is the most significant portion of what we are witnessing in the first 100 days is what I would say is a very muscular use of executive power. And when we had the Biden-Harris administration or the Obama administration, okay, or the Clinton administration, the multiple Democratic administrations that have preceded, they have had not a muscular executive approach. It has always been, well, let's see what Congress can do, even when we know that they don't have the legislative branch. And what we're seeing now is that the executive branch can do a lot of things. The executive branch can throw its power around all over the place. And then what is also really curious to me is this discussion about the judicial branch of saying they're telling them, no, you got to bring back people. No, you got to do this. You got to do that. Who are the police officers who work for the judicial branch that enforce these orders? How are they getting enforced? So it's also bringing up questions, I think, that I hope, you know, when we get to the other side of this, because balance is always a key asset of the universe. So when you get to the other side of this, I want us to remember what we witnessed so that if and when we do get back to some semblance of Democrats in power, we don't fall for the okie doke of them just having to not be the alternative. We want to see y'all go hard in the paint in the executive branch if y'all don't have the other branches of government. What can y'all do to leverage your power and make some of these things happen? And ultimately, for me, reparations should be a foundational pillar of the Democratic campaign, of their whole platform. In the past, it was getting absorbed on the other side. Like, oh, okay, we'll bring it in because we want to make sure Black people are happy. But no, it is part and parcel of how we get to this other side of people having full equity, people being included. And also there's a passage from a book called A Course in Miracles that says healing is not creation. Healing is reparations. So I want to say with reparations, we're not creating things. We're healing things. And I think this whole 100 days reveals all of the wounds and the harm and the trauma and the upset, and that there's a massive need for healing. And I think before people thought, oh, I don't know, everything seems good. You know, Kamala Harris is the first Black woman vice president. Now all of that is gone. I think it makes the scars, it makes all of the ulcers and all of the pain and the palpitations, it makes it very visible in the show that we really do need a healing.
Glenn, let me ask you this. One of the other things that is happening this week, both the Washington Post and the New York Times reporting of this mass exodus from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, and that the DOJ, which has focused on civil rights for 70 years, which has been you could argue the effectiveness of that, but it was still one of the foundational things of the Civil Rights Division. But now with these line attorneys, career attorneys, non-political appointees who are looking at the writing on the wall and saying this is not what it's supposed to be. Do you have any concerns about that kind of thing happening?
We should all be concerned. You know, to your point, civil rights legislation was the first time in the country that we actually said we were going to uphold what democratic practice means formally. Like, just that simple. Like, before then, there was literally no democracy. We can all debate how effective democracy has been, but there is no democracy when people literally do not have the right to participate. That's what the Department of Justice, that's what civil rights legislation was designed to ensure. And when you have folks, to your point, who are career folks who've been there for 30 years, leaving, we should all pay attention, right? I think the questions for us are, who's coming in behind them. I think the opportunity is recognizing that so far they haven't actually challenged what civil rights law is, right?
Not yet.
Civil rights laws, exactly, not yet. Civil rights law is protection for everybody. And I think it's one of the things we need to be totally clear. It's not just protection for women. It's not just protection for people of color. It's not just protection for people with disabilities. It is a protection for men. It's protection for white people. It is protection for people who are fully able-bodied. That is the law. In this moment, not being clear about those two things, like what is the real law, which they've manipulated endlessly, and two, who's actually coming in them. Yeah, I think it maybe the easiest. It doesn't bode well as we think about what the rest of this year and the rest of this administration looks like. So, I think, but I do want to say, because resistance matters, and I think the suits we're filing matter. I think this question of constitutional crisis that Dr. Hunter was naming about, like, if the courts say X, is the executive going to follow or not? Those questions must be called and they must be answered. And I think the more we call them, the more that everyone will hopefully hear, not just feel, why in this moment we got to stand up and fight. So that's my hope, but I think it is a critical moment for us to be paying attention to.
And to that point, Glenn, because Dr. Hunter did reference this, if you go back to Watergate, it was the Supreme Court that told then President Nixon that you must release the Watergate tapes. And he obeyed the law. Mm-hmm. We don't know whether or not there was any consideration by President Nixon to say, I'm not going to do it, even though you said I will. As Dr. Hunter said, who's the police? What is the policing agency that will be knocking on the Oval Office door?
Right.
And
us, the American people.
Right, exactly.
It has to be, right?
It has to be. But I think symbolically, yes, it has to be. But now you have what appears to be a president who's saying, "Who gonna check me, boo?" Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that
is the truth.
And there is no answer.
Right.
It's no longer a real question. Mm-hmm. It is rhetorical because nobody is checking the administration, and that is arguably one of the most, Glenn, that is I think one of the most troubling things.
Mm-hmm. No question about it. None. And I think what should we all be hearing? Democracies are fragile. Mm-hmm. Right? We like to think that it's held in place by like the military or by some enforcement agency. Y'all, we're in a group agreement. Mm-hmm. It's a social contract, right? That these things will work because we believe in them. Mm-hmm. And so in this moment, I think that's a call to Black America and to the rest of the country, which is, we know these things to be true. Are we going to stand up and actually say, yes, we hold these values as essential to who we are? Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think it's a founding question. I do want to say this. It is a founding question. We think that, we talk about the founders, right? 250 years ago. The reality is we are a baby nation. That's just the truth of it. We are young. We are founders right now. The real question of what America is going to be has not been answered. And this is the moment. This is the call. What is America? And we get the beauty in it, in my mind, is we get to determine what that outcome is going to be. So we all have to embrace that.
So I agree with that. But Dr. Hunter, here's the problem that I have with that. The Dr. Hunters and the Glenn Harrises of the world are part of the intellectual class.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough.
well read, well bred.
Oh, thank you. I'll take it.
But you both get an invitation to the cookout. But is that the conversation at the cookout about protecting democracy? I would argue that is not what Black people who are getting up and going to work every day, whether they are multi-degreed, but you still have a job. You have a mortgage, and you have 2 kids, and wife or husband, and a pit bull or whatever it is that you have in your backyard, a schnauzer, don't know, or whether you work first shift, second shift, third shift, at the factory, what have you. I would argue they're not talking, Dr. Hunter, about protecting democracy. They're talking about protecting their own, whatever their own is.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's a point well taken. I will say, I'm a regular schmegular degular Black kid from South Philly. First in my family to have a PhD.
What up, Bot?
Be a professor and all of those things. So I say that as the context to say, when I'm with my people, I'm with people. And one of the stats that I take a lot of information from the post-election was in the city that raised me, Philadelphia. 1 in 4 Black men voted for Donald Trump in Philadelphia. My dad used to always say, it's not the city of brotherly love, it's the city that don't love brothers. So in that city, 1 in 4 Black men chose Donald Trump. Now, part of what starts to happen is when you get underneath why people do it is because, one, there's all of this confusion going around about, is Kamala Black? Is this about Black men? They care about their money. We're all about money, and Trump is going to get the money. And this is why his tariffs have been, as Lizzo put, terrifying for people, because one of the big gets was like, well, he's a rich man. He know about money. I care more about money. You get my money right. And now people's money is funny. And now it's starting to get real scary. So that's real. Going to the gas station, that's real. Trying to make a birthday cake the way I grew up with, where you go get the Duncan Hines box from the third shelf of the supermarket, but then it says you got to add 2 eggs, stick of butter, and sometimes milk. All of those things now cost twice what the box of Duncan Hines costs, and we ain't even gotten to the frosting yet. Okay, so those are things that I think people are experiencing. And it's now no longer Joe Biden's fault. And also remember, there were these different things that seemingly disappeared once it wasn't Joe Biden anymore. First, it was like, we can't have an old man, somebody 70 plus, 80 be president. But then it's Donald Trump and no one is talking about that. Now, all of a sudden, you can be that age. So it's also these convenient narratives that got to go away once it was no longer Joe Biden. I think the other thing that is really important to communities is, one, that a lot of folks where I'm from have often felt like the Democratic Party, forget about them. So if you're from South Philly or you're from parts of Philly where violence is crazy right now, people are getting robbed and killed. My nephew's friend, dead, teenager, just minding his business. These are real things that people are experiencing, and they're not feeling like that's getting represented in a Democratic Party. But then you hear Donald Trump say he's hard on crime, we're going to get the streets right, and all of these other things. And ultimately what I see, and this is just a metaphor for me, is that America, for better or for worse, especially if you go to places like Japan or you go to the UK, America is a slum, and it has now been micro-targeted by the original slum lord. And so for me, it's also giving him the impulse to continue just to talk certain things and for people to fall for it. And unfortunately, this is the unfortunate part, is that people really did not believe Black women when they were saying all of these things were going to happen. I mean, everything that we've seen over these 100 days, I would be doing a disservice if I act like everything I'm saying is original. I mean, we watch people talk about this for the years leading up to the election, for the years during his first presidency, and the 107 days of Kamala Harris's run. And people made Black women feel like they were out of their minds, that they were paranoid, that they were angry, that they were all of these things that actually do not rhyme with what they were, which was telling the truth.
Dr. Hunter,
Go ahead.
Just jumping in on this conversation, because Harold, your question was about like, do Black people engage in democracy? And to be clear, Black women have been engaging in democracy and been holding it down for decades. And we see this locally, even as we're talking. So, are folks really paying attention until things get funky at federal level? Nah, not really.
Right.
But are folks paying attention at home? Yes. Right. And as we're talking, there are folks organizing in every community across this country, many of them led by Black women, towards getting better and stronger benefits to their communities in tangible ways. Right. Yeah. Whether that's around transportation or whether it's around healthcare, and that's happening right now as we're talking. And so the reason I want to make it is because the truth is that I was in Montgomery last week. And here's the deal. We talk about the civil rights movement as if like somehow nationally something magically occurred. Civil rights movement occurred in Montgomery, Alabama. That's where it occurred. It occurred locally. It is always, real change in this country has always come from what we've been able to accomplish at home. And I think in this moment, as we think about, resistance and resurgence, like where are we going to be? It's so critical that we're holding that change needs to happen here, both where we live, both with our local city government, wherever people can and are engaged. And that strength, building that muscle, is what actually ultimately dictates what federal government's going to look like in this country. And I just think it's critical that we don't forget that. And I know that in our own communities, folks haven't forgot that. There's what's happening at home matters. And if we can demonstrate it and succeed in it, that always floats to the top. It's how it's worked historically. It's how it will work moving forward.
Well, let us hope that as we wait on things to float for the top, that we do more than tread water, because there are certainly critical issues that are coming up. Some of them considerably more complex as it relates to the economy, race relations. We may notice or are noticing that our brown neighbors that we remember from last year are no longer in the house next door. Mm-hmm. And for example, our brown neighbors who are at the car wash, there are not as many of them anymore. Mm-hmm. And then in some cases, our Black neighbors who may speak with a West African accent are no longer around either. We haven't even looked in this conversation about deportations and immigration. Certainly, I would like to have both of you back so that we can explore that and many of these other issues. I really, really appreciate this conversation from the intellectual class, and the South Philadelphia swag. Glenn Harris, Dr. Marcus Hunter, thank you so very, very much. I really appreciate you spending some time with us. We will continue to watch for the next 100 days.
You already know.
Thank you. There you go. That is the Daily Drum for this Tuesday, April 29th. I'm Harold Fisher. Good night.